Right now, in our last video, we're going to dig a little bit more into race and racialization, and we're going to actually theorize how race and racial categories um, change and evolve over time, right? A process of racialization. The key framework we're going to be using here is Omi and Winant's concept of the racial project. And simply put, the idea of a racial project or racial formation is the process through which we come to define and shape ideas around categories of race, and at the same time how these ideas about race that we have as a society shape people's access to goods and social resources. What do we mean when we say social resources? Well, we're talking about access to power, property, and prestige, the 3 Ps. So jobs, titles, all those things. And we can look at how this has happened really throughout history in very different ways in Western society, really kind of through the history of capitalism in many ways. So what does all this mean? Let's make it a little bit more concrete. In the earliest days of the conquests and kind of Western expansion, we didn't have racial categories that we have today. It was more seen as a kind of a purely religious grounding. And the idea was that other non-white, non-Western cultures were simply uncivilized. That was the way it was put it. But they could, in fact, become civilized. And if there was a different access to resources, this often took the form of indentured servitude. And indeed, at the beginning of our country, we didn't have slavery. We had indentured servitude. And this was a situation in which you were indebted to somebody. And so you had to work for them, not because they owned you, but because you were in deep debt to them. Now, theoretically, in this situation, you still had access to your own being, your own body. That was your property, but you had to essentially obey the person to whom you were in debt with. Over time, many of the colonialist powers, this evolved into a kind of a caste slavery system in which individuals who were enslaved were not allowed, they didn't have rights to anything, including their own body. And we evolved away, white societies tended to move from an idea that non-white others were less civilized towards a more essentialist kind of racism. In other words, to deny people access to their very own well-being and their bodies, and even to say that the idea that it was good for them, as many supporters of slavery did, we had to get away from the idea that they potentially could become civilized, could become like us. And I use the word civilized here in quotes to define white Western societies. So we came up with these essentialist ideas of race. And this is where our first ideas of race really come from. Thinking of non-white others as a kind of a whole different species of being. And naturally, of course, as we said, these categories are always hierarchical. They are less than. So these two things develop in tandem, the way we think about and define what race is, and the ways in which this is linked to our denying non-white others access to power, property, and prestige, in this case, even the rights to their own body. Now, because of abolition, the Civil War, and social movements, slavery was done away with, as we know through our history, hopefully. But eventually this was replaced by the system of Jim Crow, which hopefully we all know is the separate but equal idea. And the idea that things should be kept separate and equal is, again, justified by a kind of a biological or scientific idea of race, or what we call scientific racism. So the essentialist ideas kind of evolved directly into this, that the unchanging nature of the lesser quality of other races is now rooted in biology, whereas before it is maybe a little less definitively scientific. And one of the things we want to think about is something we mentioned in earlier videos is, why do scientists spend so much time trying to find biological bases of race? What's in it for them? Why do people keep searching for this? Right? The problem with biological and scientific racism is that there is no biological basis for race. Yes, different races are biological beings, and they probably are different from one another, but it's not in any systematic way, right? Other than their outward appearance. And again, what we're doing here is we're linking a biological idea to justify unequal treatment. So when we look at the Jim Crow system and we see like poor schoolhouses, less, well-funding, less nice things for people of color, even though it's supposed to be separate but equal, it was often justified by saying, well, that's the way they make it, not the way we as a society make it. And so we're trying to justify this unequal treatment, this unequal access to power, property, and prestige. Today we live in an era of colorblind racism, and largely this inequality and unequal access to resources done through that system of neoliberalism, particularly through markets. So colorblind racism is a way of creating and justifying and talking about racial inequality without really explicitly referring to race. We can see this both on an individual level when people might try to say, I'm not racist, but, and then say something racist. Or we can see it at the systematic and institutional level. Right? So here's where we see things like voter ID laws, closing polling stations, redistricting. All of these disproportionately affect black folks, but when called on it, no one would say, oh, we're definitely trying to take away the votes of black people, for example. 3 strike rules, minimum sentencing. We could even think about stand your ground laws as colorblind kinds of racism. So again, we're thinking about the link between how do we define and think of race as a society and racism, and how do we use this to justify unequal treatments and make sense of unequal treatment. So the main theorist here, Eduardo Benito Silva, gives us a couple of different trends or categories in which this is done, and how we as everyday individuals tend to make sense of racial inequalities. Sometimes when I ask my students why they think more black folks are poor, they simply offer a plainly racist responses, but most of the time people know it's not okay to say things that are racist. So how do we take it, something that's clearly a racial inequality, like all those things we looked at in previous videos, lower GPA on average, and make sense of it? Well, one strategy is to individualize it. So we say, well, I don't know, I work really hard for my grades, so I guess some people must not work hard for theirs. Right? So it comes down to individual choices or efforts. We see this a lot in these discussions around police violence. What did they do, what they should have done, what choices did they make when the police stopped them in the car, for example? We try to boil it down to individual choices and say it's not about racism, it's about making bad choices. Sometimes we tend to simply try to naturalize racial inequality. And that's just the way people are, or birds of a feather flock together. So when we see things like segregation and continuing segregation, naturalization is one way in which this is done. Again, just to try to make it something that's not about society. Where we try to minimize race. When people are accused of playing the race card or overemphasizing race and racism in society. We'll dig into these a bit more in our class discussion. But all of these, again, are a way of trying to take something that on the face of it is plainly racist or creates racial inequality, and explain it away as something that's not racist. Another key way this is done is through the lens of racial resentment. This is kind of a particular kind of colorblind racism in which traditional values and individual rights that we associate with kind of Americanness and white Western values, those WASPy values, are seen as lacking in non-white others. So a great example of this was when Brian Kemp was running against Stacey Abrams. He repeatedly was talking about taxes now, and how he paid his taxes, and she hadn't paid hers. She'd actually deferred because she had to pay things for her parents. But if we wonder why is a Republican who usually hates talking about taxes talking about, I'll pay my taxes on time, why can't you? This is a great example of how racial resentment, this kind of framework, works. He's trying to dog whistle to certain voters that will see her as being irresponsible, not keeping her head down and being punctual and doing things on time like a good, responsible individual and American. And again, it's trying to kind of undermine the idea that, or underline, pardon me, the idea that she's not really deserving. Right? Another example of this, following the election, one survey, this is a survey experiment actually, people were asked about whether or not they were somewhat angry about assistance. They were asked a couple of questions about welfare. And they are given a primer or a cue of a black or a white individual and asked the exact same question. So this is an experiment in which the photo of the individual is shown to prime the respondent based on race. And what we found in the survey by Ledig et al. Is that those who support Trump are obviously much more likely to be angry about assistance, but there's a clear racial disparity. 50% said they were somewhat angry when there was a black respondent. Interestingly, for those who opposed Trump, if the picture was of a black respondent, they were less angry. Right? So kind of the opposite trend. In a similar situation, again, this is this individualizing tactic. The same respondents, when asked if individuals were somewhat to blame for their situation, needing assistance, being in poverty, we see a higher rate for the black Q than the white Q. It'd be interesting to see if there is a statistical significance here. So we'll dig into these more in our discussion during class time, but all of these are ways of thinking through how do we race and create racial categories and think about race, and how do we link this to unequal outcomes. And this can in turn give us maybe the tools to start dismantling some of those processes.